Hi. Today we will be discussing the staging of Verdi's operas, an introduction to the Disposizioni Sceniche published by Ricordi. The main point of Rosen's article is to explain that Verdi would have wanted us to follow the staging in these Disposizioni exactly, as Verdi probably saw these documents as binding instructions. And in some cases, these instructions included plot and characterization elements that Verdi probably saw as absolutely crucial to the performance of the operas. And while Rosen mentions that following a manual would not work with today's conventions, where today a director is in charge of coming up with the staging himself or herself, as well as coming up with a concept of the show, which included costumes and scenery. In Verdi's time, this would have been included in the Disposizione, and it is in David Rosen's opinion that Verdi would want these to be followed pretty much exactly, especially where Verdi specifies. Mise en scène means staging. In other words, where do the performers move and what do they do on stage? But these mise en scène go beyond staging. They also include, as I was saying before, costume design, as well as certain concepts for the actual acting of the opera. One blatant example of the importance of these staging manuals that were taken is the staging manual for Le Vêpres Sicilien. Not only does this staging manual explain how the opera actually ends, that the French hurl themselves on the Sicilians, and how that is done, but it also is an example of a staging manual that we know Verdi not only approved of, but saw as a standard for his performances. He wrote in a letter that parts of the La Mise en Scène deve restare, or parts of the La Mise en Scène must remain. This is clear evidence that Verdi not only approved of these mise en scène booklets, but that he felt that they were needed in order to perform his operas accurately and effectively. We do have other staging manuals for Verdi's works after Le Vêpres Sicilien, and these manuals are called the Disposizioni Sceniche, and they're published by Ricordi. For the staging manual for the mise en scène of Le Vêpres, we have very good evidence that Verdi thought that these were not only accurate stagings of the production, but that they were very useful and should be followed by directors. We do not have that same evidence for his other operas. However, David Rosen gives us reason to believe that Verdi was instrumental in a part of making most of these booklets, and that he did approve of them. Excuse me. Philip Gossett explains in his chapter Transmission versus Tradition, in his book Divas and Scholars, that Verdi became more active with Ricordi in making sure that his work was published accurately. David Rosen also uses Aida's Disposizione as further evidence of Verdi's approval of these documents, since Verdi's Aida Disposizione quotes verbatim many of Verdi's staging notes that he took in the margins of his libretto. Scenery changes nowadays can be basically done on a whim, since modern lighting allows us to black out the stage, move scenery, and bring the lights back up very quickly and effectively. In Verdi's time, however, this was different. Scene changes were done either between acts, when the curtain was down, or between scenes, a vista, which means at sight, in plain sight of the audience. These scene changes a vista included the beginning of Un Ballo at the governor's palace. The governor's palace was painted on a canvas, and at the end of the scene, the canvas was removed to reveal Ulrica's dwelling. Some of these scene changes are not as effective and not as simple and can be at times awkward. A good example of this awkwardness is in La Forza del Destino, when it is instructed that chairs and tables be taken off during the singing of Egli è salvo. I want you to listen to this cabaletta and imagine that people are dragging off chairs and tables noisily while the baritone is trying to sing this part.
È salvo, buongiorno! Sull'infami vendicare lei allora vendi posti di la lira e fraile la posi di le tue riferito e del sangue di tuo padre di quel volto rosseggiare oh felice penserei se potesse il brano mio oh Aglio da voi non posso sacrare almeno due aglio da voi non posso sacrare due posso sacrare fatore sacrare.
Even though these changes a vista were often awkward, they also had benefits. Often Verdi used the opportunity to create musical continuity between scenes by adding music to the scene change. The disposizione for Verdi's Otello is 3 times longer than Un Ballo's and offers great insight for directors and scholars into Verdi's intentions for the opera. We know by looking at the disposizione that the storm at the beginning of Otello was very important. Not just that we knew there was a storm, but that we actually saw the storm and felt that it was there. We know that because there are detailed plans in the booklet that explain how to create the storm. We also know that Verdi included lighting changes almost exclusively for natural phenomenon, like sunrises, sunsets, and storms, which leads us to believe that these natural phenomena are created something deeper in Verdi's works and are actually a use of visual symbolism. David Rosen makes this argument quite convincingly in the article. Verdi's Otello contains a very unique staging at the beginning of the opera during the storm scene, where the chorus is instructed to walk and turn towards Otello specifically as he begins to sing. This kind of detailed instruction is unusual for the chorus, who usually is just told to act realistically. But this is so unusual because it highlights another character's movement, Iago. Since the chorus is moving towards Otello, Iago is moving away from him, and it gives the audience a first glimpse into the chief villain of the opera, Iago. Also, the disposizione offers insight into characterization through staging, specifically when Iago is instructed to move in a serpentine manner, which highlights his snake-like personality. Here's an illustration of that serpentine move. In conclusion, I thought that David Rosen's article was extremely informative and interesting, especially considering that this type of view on staging is not currently the view held by many opera directors. Also, it's important to note that David Rosen was trying to make the argument that these documents were extremely important to modern-day productions, and people still producing Verdi operas, obviously. However, I think that there is a part of his argument that is weakened by the mention of the scene changes. A vista scene changes do not seem to be relevant anymore, because most directors would think of these as silly nowadays because of the new technology available in opera houses. I think that if he had left that part out, or maybe briefly mentioned it, it would have strengthened his argument a little bit more, that these are truly important documents for today. Also, at the bottom of page 451, he uses attempt instead of attempts. Just a little error. But I thought that his article was clear and concise. I thought that it was very interesting, and I hope you thought it was too.